Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. My name's Fiddle. Today I'll be showing you how to make a mid-19th century baby bouncer. This piece came about because while I was looking for ideas on the baby furniture that I was going to make, I found this photo and it caught my attention. I really liked both pieces, but I knew that the bouncer would be a little bit difficult and my skills weren't there yet. So I put it off to the side. Until last tutorial, after the long mirror, I really needed to figure out what I wanted to make next to fill up the space in the room. That led me to a Google search and a pretty decent photo. Now I had to figure out how to recreate this thing in miniature. My first attempt didn't go so great. I really didn't like it. Instead of using wood, I used layers of really thick chipboard and I messed up while painting it, so it didn't come out right and I knew I could do better. So I gave myself a day to fix the pattern and find the right wood pieces to use to make it. Attempt number 2 came out much better, though it does still have some of its problems, but that's okay. I'm happy enough with it that I can set it aside and maybe come back if I ever want to try again. All of that just to say that this is your friendly reminder to allow yourself to make mistakes and to give yourself credit for the things that you get right in life and in miniatures. Okay, now that that's out of the way, don't forget to check the link in the description and that'll take you to the scavenger hunt where you'll find the list of materials and the free printable pattern that you can use to make this piece for yourself. Okay, let's get started. The first thing we need to do is cut out our paper pattern pieces. I have found that when you're cutting round shapes like this out of paper where you need a void in the center, it's easier to cut out the void and then cut out the outside edge than it is to go from the outside in. Now we can move on to tracing our pieces on our wood. To stabilize your pattern while you're tracing it, you can glue it down with a cheap glue stick and pull it off when you're done. It won't do any damage to the wood. Because we are using solid pieces and not the plywood, we need to pay attention to the wood grain and which direction it's going. That will really help us later. You can pause the screen and write down the arrows so you know which direction your pieces need to go. Before you lift your pattern piece, use an awl or some kind of pointy tool to poke holes where you need to drill later. Sorry, I forgot to mention the awl on the scavenger hunt. For the bed rim, it's easier to cut the piece in half, then use a knife or rotary tool to carve out the inside. I used my Dremel and it made it a lot faster and easier, especially since there's really not that much detail. Once you have the center carved out, glue your two halves back together. I left the end bits that we need to glue back together a little bit thicker to make sure that I get both sides of the circle even. Okay, the wood grain direction really shows its use in this part, especially if you're just using a hand tool. To carve out the half circular areas on the rim back piece, I think I called them, we need to make vertical slits all the way across from our draw line down. You'll notice that the knife goes through pretty smoothly and you should be able to get pretty clean cuts, although you may have to be wary that you might crack all the way through. But just know that if you do, you can always glue it back together and you can always fill in the cracks. Once you've made it to the other side, go back through and cut following your line. It may take you some time, but this is one way to get the pieces out if you don't have a power tool. But when you do get it, we don't have to worry about fine sanding right now. We just really need the rough shape because we're going to glue the pieces together before we do the fine sanding. But for now, we're going to set it to the side and move on to carving out the legs. I did use my Dremel for the outside shape, and for the center of the legs, I carved that out by hand with my knife. Then I held it together with some clamps to do the fine sanding and drill the hole through the center. I wasn't able to record that part because I do my Dremel working outside, and my setup's not that portable. Okay, for the next pieces, we're going to be doing the support bars. These need to be thicker than they are wider, so rectangle dowels would be good for this, or just a thin strip of wood. Stack your two pieces wide sides together and mark a spot about 1/4 of an inch away from one end. Clamp your pieces together and drill a hole at your mark. Okay, so I messed up on the pattern and didn't know until now. There are supposed to be 3 of these little half circles, and I only have 2 on the pattern. But really all you need to do is cut one that is just a little bit smaller than the little one. Sorry about that, I will adjust the pattern before I upload the video. Anyways, we're going to stack and glue our three pieces together and clamp them down with some clamps. Set it aside and let it dry. The next few pieces that we're going to cut out and glue together are the support beams. Wide popsicle sticks would also be a good option, but you may have to double them over to get a good thickness to make it sturdy enough. I used the lines of my craft mat to make sure that I had everything centered. I chose to use a thicker bar for the top part because we need a bit wider space here to allow for the metal piece to be attached to it. Set it aside to dry and we're going to move on to drilling the holes in both the bed and the rim. Now we can sand the base all smooth, but it's a different story for the rim. As I told you earlier in the tutorial when we were cutting the piece out, how to leave just the edges a little bit thicker, we're going to go ahead and sand that down now. The reason why we waited until now was so that way when our pieces were together, it would be an even sanding, whereas if we still had our pieces separate, our lines might be off, and that could throw off the inside shape. So it's a lot easier just to leave it thicker in that area and come back and smooth it out later. Once you're happy with the shape, we're going to grab the other rim pieces and glue them on. Set it aside to dry and we're going to start cutting our posts. I used fancy ended toothpicks, but I'm sure regular ones will get you there. Our posts need to be 1 inch long each, and you should need 14 in all. Now that we've got them all measured, we got to cut them down to size. I know 1 inch may seem a bit big, but you also have to consider that we're going to be poking these through the bottom and through the upper rim, so there's going to be quite a bit taken up by that. And we need some wiggle room for when we put the pieces together. Once you've got all of them cut, set them aside for now. We're going to turn our attention to our bed support spacer. We'll have to do some strange measuring here. You'll need a scrap piece of paper and our bottom beams along with the legs. Build the setup as I have where you have the thicker legs towards you. Once you have your pieces set, mark a line on both outer sides. Now take your bed support spacer and lay it over top and mark your lines on it. Try to make sure that you've got your pattern piece centered as best as you can. That's why we used a scrap piece of paper instead of our pattern piece, just because it's so small that it's easy to get sideways. Then using a straight edge, draw a line completely across your pattern piece. Now that we've got an accurate pattern, we can cut it out. The whole reason why we had to go through this process is because our wood thicknesses may vary, mainly meaning the thickness of the legs, and that difference could mean it working or not. As you can see, I figured it out because I had to fix mine. Now we're ready to glue the bed support system together. You'll need the bed base, support bars, and spacer. I glued mine a little on the high side, so bring yours down about midway to the bed. Setting mine too high up made it to where the bed sags a little more than the other one, so I think by bringing it closer to the middle of the bed will give it a little bit more support. And be sure that your drill holes are at the opposite end. I almost glued mine the opposite. Set it aside to dry and we can finish up the baby bed rim. For this, it's gonna be a lot of sanding. I mean a lot of sanding. This is another good time to use a Dremel, but I went ahead and did it all by hand. And a lot of it was out of frame, so I'll just skip this part and move on to painting. I gave everything but the posts a coat of watered down brown paint. Once your pieces are dry, it's time to start the assembly process. The first pieces we are going to put together are the supports and the legs. Use a toothpick and poke through one side of the support. Then add on a leg. Next, the other leg. If you wanted to add a spacer bead in between the two legs, you could. I just couldn't find one that fit properly. Then finally through the other side of the support. Move one leg to either side and let's test fit it and see if it works. I love it when a piece functions. Okay, now that we know that it fits and works, we can go ahead and trim off the ends of the toothpick. If you wanted to add a bead to either side to finish it off, that would probably look really good too. Okay, time for the crib part. First, we need to poke our posts into the rim. For the ones underneath the back crust, you can only go so far with it because of our other layers, but that's okay, get them in as far as you can. For the ones that are just in the rim itself, poke them all the way to where you can feel them on the other side. I like the way it's looking so far, but I wanted to add more detail, so I put some beads on each one of the posts. It took me a few tries to decide on what ones I wanted to use. Okay, the next part might test your patience, so before you start, take a few deep breaths. Okay, now we're going to start inserting the pegs into the base. This may take you a few tries and quite a bit of time to get on. I will say that surprisingly enough, it was easier to put this one together this way than it was for the cardstock one. Start with the top three most pegs underneath the rim. Once you have them inserted enough to where you can fill them through the bottom, then move on to the next one, doing the same thing. Keep going until you've met back at the other end. I used like a wiggle method where I would get the peg or post, whatever you want to call it, just above the hole, and then I would squeeze and wiggle at the same time, the whole piece. So that way I was pushing down on both the top and bottom. Wiggling it kind of forced it in a little bit easier. Though you have to watch how far you wiggle, because if you go too far, you might go all the way through or break a stick or something like that. It took me about a good 10 minutes to get them in. We made it. It got a little scary there for a minute at the end where my last peg came out. Thankfully, I was able to get it back in and glue the piece back together, and you can't even tell. The only thing that bothered me about this piece was the holes in the top rim, but I painted over the end of them with a little bit of the watered down paint, and that did help, but you can still tell that there's holes there. If you wanted to fill yours in or even add another layer to that part of the rim to cover the holes, you could. You have the pattern piece, and all you would have to do is cut out two of the rims instead of just one. So it's an easy solution to fix it. I was a little off screen for the next part, but we need to glue the supports to the base of the bed. Make sure you're gluing your pieces to where there's a gap between the bed and our wood spacer piece. This is the slot that our plastic metal goes into. It's starting to look better and better. Set it aside to dry, and we're going to move on to our plastic metal stuff. For this piece, I used a ramen bowl lid rim. It's a really hard plastic for the most part, but it does have some flexibility to it, and that kind of reminded me of metal, and it was about the only thing that I could find. And it don't have that inside lip rim like most lids do. It's just a straight solid piece. Now, if you do have thin strips of some type of flat metal that does have some sort of give to it, that would be a better idea than a lid rim. But if you don't have that, this is a good option. Before you paint the plastic, give it a good sanding, and I would suggest something that other than acrylic paint. I don't have any plastic fast paint, so this was my next best option. I did mix the paint with Aleene's, hoping that that would make it a little more stick-to-ity, but it didn't. So definitely use a plastic paint for this part. To hold on to it and help it stand up while it was drying, I added paper clamps to one end. For the next part, you'll need two bobby pins, or if you have it, a stapler. We're going to be essentially turning the bobby pins into staplers to hold our plastic to our wood. Start by cutting the straight side off of the bobby pin. That's the piece we'll be using. Then using your pliers, bend it into a horseshoe or staple shape. Next, use your pliers and dig it into the wood where we're going to be poking it through. This will give you basically like little drill holes. Once the holes are set, see if you can slide your metal or plastic, whatever you're using, through them. If not, you'll have to poke holes in the plastic for your bobby pin to go through. I would also add a bit of multi-surface glue here, E6000 or something like that. I don't have any right now, so I didn't get the opportunity to do that. Mine is just held together with the staples. Once you have them set in place, give them a good squeeze. Just be careful you don't squeeze too hard and fracture your wood. I chipped mine, but it can be fixed with paint. Now we're ready to glue our two halves together. Because we can't exactly see what's going on in this photo, and this is the better one of the two, the only way I could see this thing being put together was by adding glue to the inside four corners of each leg, setting it in place over top of it. I did go back through after this bit had dried and put more glue on it just to make sure that they were held together as good as I possibly could. Let it dry completely before moving on to the next step. The last thing we need to do is run our metal through our bed. I know my pieces aren't glued together here, but that's so you can see where you need to string this through. Start by looping the plastic up over the middle bar, then up underneath the crib. Go between the spacer bar and the crib bottom. Now push it through to your desired bendiness and cut the end off. And with that, it brings us to the end of our tutorial. I hope this gives you ideas for your next piece. If you've made it this far, thank you for being here. My next piece will be a drafting table, something similar to these two. If you'd be interested in seeing that and haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you, Ginger, and I'll see you next time.